Bruce Tony Team Ref.
All right, let's get this show on the road. So my name is George Chang. The session is called Meet DEF, your new BFF. And for those of you who don't know what DEF is, it stands for Data Exchange Framework. So this is me. I work at Proficient. You can find me on LinkedIn on any of these links. You can find me on Twitter. If you're planning on tweeting during this, you can use the hashtag SUGCON or DEFMyBFF. This is what I look like this photo is what I look like when I haven't been locked in my house for the past month. So much more human and much less homeless. All right, so to begin off, we're gonna do a little audience participation. Gonna throw this poll in the SUGCON channel in Slack. So if you wanna hop in and give your answer, that would be awesome. And so today, what we're gonna talk about is first, kind of the difference between data and content. Data exchange framework itself, pretty important. The tenant service, which is a piece of the data exchange framework. We'll look at kind of some a demo / example of kind of how it all works together, all these little pieces that we're going to be talking about, and then all kind of glued together with a bunch of disjointed pop culture references throughout the presentation, of course. So we'll begin with data versus content. So if you kind of imagine this blue blob being all the data that is being managed in an organization, right? So there might be a piece of it that's a subset that's product information that you have that's stored in a PIM. Some of it might be some customer data that you have stored in a CRM. And some of it might be content that's managed by Marcom or some digital strategy group or some kind of communications group, right? Basically, what we want to see is that content is just a chunk of data that's owned by your organization at the end of the day. And the difference between content and that other data is that content is a set of data that's used to deliver a particular message. Hey, what a great slide. Content is a set of data used to deliver a particular message. So I do want to add that this includes data that's needed for personalization, right? So personalized content obviously is a very specific message that's being delivered. So kind of knowing this, got 3 simple rules that we want to go through about data in Sitecore and how to manage data in Sitecore. So rule number 1, the content tree it's called the content tree for a reason. So I'm sure we've all kind of come across some unruly content trees over our experience with working with Sitecore. We just talked about the difference between data and content. So what should go into your content tree, right? It really should just be content. And if it's not content, you may want to reconsider. So if you're wondering if you have this piece of data and you're wondering, hey, should I put it into Sitecore? Kind of have to consider it in the context of something someone really good looking said once, is that the intent of that data to deliver a particular message to the end user, right? Or is that some kind of data that you're just providing for informational purposes? That, not to say that this data doesn't have value, but is it intentionally communicating a message? And more often than not, an easy way to figure that out is, where was that content created, right? It's very obvious when you create web pages in Sitecore, obviously that content is content, right? But when you're creating, product information in a PIM, typically if it's not created in Sitecore and it's created outside of Sitecore, you can, just as a general rule of thumb, consider that to be data that doesn't need to go into Sitecore. Rule number 2 is know your source of truth and stick to it. So something very important is to know kind of where the source of the truth of your data is coming from, right? So for content, that's going to be Sitecore or some kind of managed content hub, something that Sitecore has. For product information, that might be a PIM. For customer information, that might be a CRM. We live in this kind of digital marketing age of like this 360-degree view of the customer, and having all the relevant data for any kind of particular direction that a company is going. So all this data that a company has is aggregated and used as part of their go-to-market strategy. But often that data is duplicated, right? What happens is, oh, this system needs this data, so let's import this chunk of data over here. So system A and system B is retrieving some data out of system C, but then system D and system E are retrieving that same data out of system F, who got it from system C, right? Like you start getting into the spider web of data sources throughout your organization. So really, rule number 2 is really to ensure that you know what the source of truth for that piece of data is, and whether that's in Sitecore or somewhere else, and make sure that you're using that source of truth for your data instead of a stale copy of data that you might be getting from somewhere else. Obviously, this is kind of goes bigger than Sitecore. This takes organizational changes, and other systems that need to be up to sync once you kind of establish which is the source of truth for what kind of data. Then rule number 3 is YAGNI, which is common across the developer community. For you aren't going to need it, or here in the American South, it's you ain't going to need it. So it's tempting to pull in all the data that you're planning on using into Sitecore, right? So I have a product, it's in PIM, I want to pull all the information because I want to display it on my product detail page. But you're potentially kind of going against rules 1 and 2 because of that. So you should only pull the data that you need to support your content, and then access the remaining information that you plan on putting on your page, whether through APIs to your PIM system or through a service bus. If you have an enterprise service bus to manage all that content, that's huge in kind of organizing all the data that you have in an organization. So kind of back to our example of of the PIM and having product detail pages, right? If you want to create a product detail page every time you have a new product show up in your PIM, you might be tempted, we're going to import all the product information, the product name, the IDs, the specifications, the images, the corresponding PDF documentation. We're going to stick that into Sitecore and the media library, and that's where we're going to serve it out of, right? And Sitecore is just going to, the pages, the product detail pages are just going to look into Sitecore and put it on a page for users to access. But there's kind of 2 things that we want to take into consideration as we're going through this process, right? One is, does the version that you import into Sitecore, is that going to go stale for a period of time, right? If your PIM is being updated, but the data in your Sitecore instance isn't being updated at that same kind of frequency, or even a much more delayed frequency, is that going to be a problem? And also, if it's not going to be a problem, there might be good candidates to be moved in, right? So product name and model numbers, those things typically don't change. The second thing is that, is it a good idea to devote a portion of your content management system resources to host this copy of the data, right? The data isn't free, storage isn't free, processing power isn't free. So, the data that you're importing could be potentially hundreds of megabytes to gigabytes, right? So there's something to take into consideration. Do you need to import all that data, or does that already live somewhere else that we can have access to? The ideal scenario is that we have some kind of basic information that's getting pulled in from these disparate systems, such as like product names and model numbers and such, and imported into a Sitecore item, and then an API gets hit to retrieve that remaining product data from a PIM. So with these kind of 3 rules in mind, let's take a look at data exchange framework and how it fits in the grand scheme of things. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with data exchange framework, this is going to be a 30-second overview of what it is and what it does. So for beginners, it's a framework, right? It's based off of a provider-based architecture, like most things in Sitecore is. So it makes it really easy to be able to add custom providers and makes it very extensible to add on to this, which is very important for a framework. So this means that the data exchange framework pretty much can work with any system that you can write code for, at least C# code for, right? Sitecore does provide some providers for Sitecore itself, for XConnect, for SQL Server databases, and for MongoDB. The data exchange framework, while it is a module provided by Sitecore, right, doesn't require you to use Sitecore as one of its sources or targets, right? So you could use data exchange framework to transfer data from SQL to MongoDB, for instance, or MongoDB to SQL. In fact, that's the XDB migration tool. That's what it does, is it migrates data from MongoDB to SQL without actually having to go through Sitecore. So you don't get much out of the box, but you get a framework to be able to build things on top of. And then, this is a framework that exchanges data, obviously. So this process is, you've often heard it as ETL, right? It stands for extract, transform, and load. So you're extracting data from your source, you're transforming it into a shape that your target system would be able to take in and be able to use, and then you load it into that system. And data exchange framework also supports bi-directional exchange of data. So it's not just always Sitecore to another system, or another system to Sitecore, or it's not just Sitecore to another system, but it can also be that same system back to Sitecore for different amounts of information. So what are some things that we can do with data exchange framework? And these are just some kind of basic examples. Obviously, you can do a lot more. So with a connection from a product information system to Sitecore, we've kind of discussed this example a little bit, where anytime you add new products into a PIM, data exchange framework can go in and create new product detail pages in Sitecore. So you don't have to go in and create a new page every time you get a new item that a new offering that you're putting out to the market. Also, you can push from Sitecore to CRM. So it's like one of the kind of add-ons for data exchange framework that Sitecore provides is a custom save action, so that you can trigger a data exchange framework action pipeline whenever you submit a form. So you can update your customer CRM record when a Sitecore form submission occurs. And almost in reverse, right now we have, if we have an ERP to Sitecore, right? So if a user purchases a product, the ERP is aware of it, and that can trigger some kind of marketing automation campaign in Sitecore for Sitecore to dish up some kind of marketing automation to that user the next time they're on, because they know that they've purchased this item. And then kind of in a similar vein, right, like CRM directly to XDB. So we have CRM, and we have data in CRM that's outside of, that collects information outside of a person's web presence. We can update XDB from this data in CRM to provide a richer, fuller profile for XDB to be able to do its personalization and other marketing automation things. So this sounds great and all, right? We can do all these cool things, but why are there's still some people that I feel like are unsure about data exchange framework, right? So data exchange framework, it just wants to be used, it wants to be loved, even if it has to send you awkward text messages. Kind of in talking to some people about data exchange framework recently, kind of in preparation for this session, some of the kind of most common reasons why people either don't use data exchange framework or don't have a good impression of data exchange framework. One of them is, look, I already use Sitecore PowerShell extensions. What do I need data exchange framework for? Don't they pretty much do the same thing? Also, data exchange framework, it's really complicated. There's a lot going on, and it seems overkill for what I'm trying to do in setting up some data migration. Also, data migration isn't cheap. If you're doing a lot of kind of pulling in of data and transforming of that data, it takes a good amount of processing power. And this is all running on your content management server. And so, I don't want these processes happening on my content management server. Side note, the acronym for Data Exchange Framework is DEF and not DXF. But, kind of, we'll talk about each one of these things, but I think once we really dig into the data exchange framework and can see what you can do with it, you'll want to tell your friends all about it as well. Then again, maybe you've already used data exchange framework and you didn't even know it. So data exchange framework is actually kind of the foundation for the Sitecore Connect for Salesforce module, the Sitecore Connect for the Dynamics 365 module, and kind of mentioned earlier that also the MongoDB XDB migration tool to SQL Server uses data exchange framework as its underpinnings. So let's address some of those concerns that we just talked about, right? The first one out of the gate is this whole SPE thing. Why would I need Sitecore PowerShell extensions if I already have, or why would I need data exchange framework if I already have Sitecore PowerShell extensions? So you can see here, data exchange framework, Sitecore PowerShell extensions, they're pretty evenly matched in kind of the power that they bring. But really, let's go through some pros and cons on each of these, right? So with data exchange framework, this is a first-party module from Sitecore, so Sitecore does provide support for it. It's a familiar deployment process. It's not, it's basically Sitecore items, some DLLs, much like any other kind of Sitecore deployment. There's no additional licensing. It comes free. But from a con perspective, yeah, there is a pretty steep learning curve. And also, it's not PowerShell for how much we love PowerShell. I love PowerShell. And then on the Sitecore PowerShell extension side, right, some pros are, it's a familiar syntax. We know PowerShell, we use it outside of Sitecore, at least you should be, for managing a number of things. So there's a low barrier of entry, right? And it's open source, so you can always kind of dig in and make pull requests and make improvements as you see fit. On the flip side, right, from an enterprise perspective, there's not this sense of enterprise support. Michael West and Adam Nagy are super responsive and on top of all the development for Sitecore PowerShell extensions, but I don't think they're going to be very happy if some CTO of some Fortune 500 company calls them up at 3 a.m. demanding a patch for something. And also, Sitecore PowerShell extensions runs on the W3 WP process on your content management instance. So it's going to be sharing those server resources. But really, we see kind of these two tools, they really serve two different purposes. So why not use them together? So we kind of let each platform do what it does best, right? So for data exchange framework, we let it handle some of the heavy lifting for data migration, for kind of triggered actions to trigger pipelines to do things. So, with webhooks or the like, right? With API integrations, I know you can do it with PowerShell as well, but because everything is just C# code, right? Any NuGet package from an API perspective, you can load in pretty easily, and you get first-party modules for Salesforce and Dynamics 365 and such that's provided by Sitecore. And then on the Sitecore PowerShell extension side, right? Sitecore PowerShell extensions, it's great for item management, it's great for scripting, it's great for ad hoc tasks, and it's great for reporting for more on the kind of content author facing side of the world, right? So I think there's a place for both. Personally, I love Sitecore PowerShell extensions. I won't have a Sitecore instance without it, but for specific scenarios where we need to regularly migrate a lot of data, data exchange framework may be your answer. The second big topic was, it's complicated. The documentation that for data exchange framework is really extensive, but the framework is so encompassing, and there's not, it doesn't come with anything, so it's not like you can just have an example as soon as you install it. So there is some bits of complication. Basically, data exchange framework, you can look at it like this. It's just a pile of Lego bricks, right? This is what data exchange framework gives you. And with it, you can build anything you want, anything you imagine, right? But more importantly, kind of anything what your stakeholders can imagine, which sometimes is a problem, because you might be asked to take your Legos and build something like this, right? And for those of you who aren't aware and aren't in this world, this is the perpetually out of stock Lego Millennium Falcon model number 75192. Runs about $800 US, 7,541 pieces, which makes it the largest Lego set ever created. Weighs in at 37 pounds or 17 kilos for those of you who use normal measurements, with a 30-hour estimated build time, right? And just as a side note, some of you might even be wondering, what does the instruction book look like to build this thing? And here it is. It's spiral bound, for starters. It's 466 pages with 1,379 steps. That book itself is 6.5 pounds or 3 kilos. So the job of the developer really is to, for better or for worse, you're the one that's going to be writing this instruction book, right? You've got your Legos, you know what it looks like, you've got the picture on the box, that's what the business gives you. And you get to put it all together kind of based on with the bricks that you have and the picture on the box, and you write the book to be able to do so. And hopefully it'll take less than 30 hours. But in order to do that, you kind of have to understand, one, what are all these pieces that you have to work with, and two, how they fit together. Not all pieces will fit together exactly the same or fit together at all. So first, we'll kind of talk about the process mapping in data exchange framework. So all the data process and data exchange framework, I know this is a little small on the right, but it's all mapped in the Sitecore content tree, right? And I know this kind of is weird going against, don't put not content in the content tree, but you can look at this as more as settings more than anything else, right? So all your data processes, they're modeled in the Sitecore content tree. They're just Sitecore items. You model things like endpoints, which is kind of the source on the target that you're hitting, pipelines, pipeline steps, readers, which read from your source, and writers, which write to your targets. Because they're Sitecore items, you get other cool benefits like security and versioning and workflow and serialization to Unicorn that you can put so that you can keep these processes, versioned and version controlled and deployable with the rest of your application. And then once you have that model down, right, you can write the code to kind of fill in the gaps of what each thing does. So for example, there's a chunk of code here. It's using the kind of the abstractions that data exchange framework gives you. This one's for a converter for a reader. And then once you write the code, basically in the Sitecore item, you give it the fully qualified namespace for that code, and that's what it runs in order to do that step. So kind of to understand the rest, there's two key concepts that we need to talk about. The first is pipelines. This one's a little bit more straightforward because it's very similar to how Sitecore does pipelines. So DEF defines these processes through a series of pipelines, and they're executed in order, and they perform tasks just like kind of Sitecore pipelines, and you manage kind of how the order and the logic of all these pipeline steps, right? The second one is the data mapping, right? And this part's a little bit different than kind of normal Sitecore, which is you have your source data and you have your target data. What field what data out of my source data maps to what field on my target area, right? And this is where that data mapping comes into play of, kind of defining all those mappings between fields. It could be multiple fields from the source, kind of consolidated down to a single field in your target, or vice versa, right? So there's a lot of kind of logic that goes along with it. All right. So with pipelines, quick diagram. So kind of the overarching umbrella is this idea of a pipeline batch, which is basically just a collection of pipelines. So you can run a number of pipelines together in a sequential order. These pipelines then call independent pipeline steps, or they can call other pipelines, even iterate through multiple pipelines. So if I had a piece of data that was, that was like, hey, take this collection of things and then process each one of them through this separate pipeline, that's what it can do. So we have our pipeline steps, and then with each pipeline step, we have these idea of, converters, processors, value mapping sets, which is kind of a little bit less familiar if you're not familiar with data exchange framework. So quick crash course. A converter basically takes one of those Sitecore items that we looked at earlier that has configuration in it, and takes that and changes, basically maps that into a C# object, right? Which in DEF land is known as a plugin. The processor is where the work happens, right? This is where you take that data, you process it how you do, you flip it, you reverse it. And then a value mapping set, which is basically a set of mappings, and we'll talk about this part more in the next slide. Basically, it's a value reader and a value writer to determine kind of what from your target is being read, and what from your source is being read, and what to your target is being written to. So this data mapping idea, right? We typically have our source endpoint, our target endpoint, and essentially we have this idea of a reader and a writer. So the source endpoint, the reader is going to pull data from your source endpoint, and then the writer is going to write it to your target endpoint. The collection of these is called a value mapping. So for each thing that you're mapping over, you have a reader and then a writer. That's maybe for one piece of data, you can have multiple value mappings, right? For a particular set of data, and then a grouping of those value mappings is a value mapping set. So, this is kind of how it breaks down into how that data is being transformed from your source to your target. I know there's a lot of new nomenclature in here that you may not be familiar with if you're not familiar with data exchange framework. But honestly, I'd say it's not that complicated, right? We have your tenants and your pipeline batches and your pipelines and your contexts and your steps and your endpoints and accessors and readers and writers, and okay, maybe it is a little bit complicated, and maybe there is a lot to go through. But I think once you kind of understand the underpinnings of what each of these things do, or just kind of a general broad idea of what some of these terms are, it makes a lot more sense. All right, and the last thing to remember about data exchange framework, if you learn nothing else during the session, is that data exchange framework is DEF and not DXF. You're gonna make some Sitecore product owners very angry if you call it DXF. All right, moving on to our next topic. That's right, the data exchange framework tenant service. So the tenant service is a thing that it's kind of an extension of data exchange framework. It's a separate application to handle the execution of data exchange framework tasks. This can be hosted on a separate server or even in containers, since it's a .NET Core application. But basically, it minimizes access by minimizing the connections to the Sitecore server, which we'll kind of see in a second. Because it's kind of a web service, you can trigger it from external services, you can trigger it from webhooks, you can trigger it from message queues. And because it executes all that logic on the tenant service itself instead of the content management server, you also need to make sure that any kind of custom code that you're deploying to the content management server for for any kind of custom logic also gets deployed to the tenant service itself. So we have our tenant service, right? I looked onto the Sitecore's media kit. They didn't have a tenant service logo, so we make do with what we have. And then we have Sitecore. This is where all that data exchange framework configuration is stored in the content tree. So the tenant service receives a request and says, hey, Sitecore, what do I need to do for this request for a pipeline? And Sitecore says, hey, here, go do this. Here's a set of instructions for you to go do. The tenant service says, okay, cool, thanks, and executes it. And so here's our source and our target, right? And just for the sake of this diagram, they're outside out in the ether, but one of them could very well be that same Sitecore instance that you pulled the configuration from. But for the sake of this diagram, to keep it less confusing, right? It could be CRM and XDB, for example, right? Some two systems that are getting data. So the tenant service goes, pulls the data from the source, does the transformation, and then pushes that updated transform data into the target. We'll see that there's a very kind of clear separation between the Sitecore instance and then the source and the target instances, right? It's kind of has this tenant service as kind of a buffer. So I like seeing the tenant service because from an architectural perspective, right, there is some amount of safety built in where, if your process fails, if your transformation fails and it crashes your process because of some bad code that I didn't write, your tenant service crashes. It doesn't crash your entire W3 WP process in your Sitecore server. So always a plus there that you're kind of abstracting that a little bit away from the Sitecore process itself. All right, so let's look at some code really quick. Quick little demo. Hopefully you guys can see this. All right, so let's start with the Sitecore pieces. Oh, so to give you an idea of what this demo is so basically I'm using data exchange framework to ping a WordPress blog, in this case our Proficient blog, right? And use their JSON API to pull in some data about authors, about categories, about blog posts into my Sitecore instance, right? So kind of use case for this is if I want to be able to have a personalization rule to serve up kind of specific blog posts for a particular category for a user, right? I need some of that information in Sitecore to be able to dish out that personalization. So we're pulling kind of the minimal amount we really need. So everything's defined under this data exchange module. I don't know how well you can see this. Let's blow this up a little bit. So everything's under this data exchange module. I have my tenant. I have these pipelines. One is to basically grab all the authors and categories, and then one is to grab the blog posts because our blog posts are going to have a dependency on those authors and categories. There's a bunch of other things that oh, fantastic. Let's get back in here. All right, system, data exchange, tenant. All right, so there are other things like the individual pipelines that we run. So we have pipelines for posts, to read those posts, to process those posts. So we were talking about that iteration thing earlier. Basically, it's going to call this pipeline to read all those posts, and then it's going to iterate through each one of those posts and process them one by one. So this pipeline winds up calling this process pipeline. And then we have the value mapping. So we map kind of the ID of an author. There's a level of accessors and everything. I'm not going to get too much into detail of some of this stuff, but else we'll be here all night, and we just don't have that time. But just to kind of give you an idea of what one of these actually looks like, right? Then on the code side, we're basically writing this code for some of these things. So if we look at that, which one is this? The read paginated JSON one. I don't exactly know which one that is. All right, but anyways, the idea is that you write this code, you always wind up with some kind of base class to work off of. This is a converter, kind of as we talked about earlier. The converter transforms that Sitecore item into some kind of POCO to be able to do whatever, to take in that configuration and be used as part of the processing event. And so a little bit of code here, which is basically to make sure that it matches the template ID from a, to match the right template to pull the right data points out of. There's this idea of plugins, which is basically just more kind of POCO objects that are stored in the pipeline context. So we need to know, to be able to read the JSON API, we need to know what the endpoint is, right? Where are we pulling this from? And then we need to have some settings. So I have some settings in here that, hey, this is the max number of items that we're going to pull. This is the starting page that I want to start on. This is paginated, right? So I want to start on page 3, for instance. I would have this as a setting. I would have an offset of, you know, how many items I want to offset, and then how many results I want to see, or how many results are being returned per page, right? So these are all kind of settings that are being read out of a Sitecore item. You know, that Sitecore item looks like data exchange providers. Not this one. This one. Not this one. All right. Of course, can't find it when I need to find it. So you're writing this code. You have your converter. You have your processor, kind of where all this is running. You can load in. You can say, here are the plugins I need. So hey, I need this API. I need this endpoint, right? And I need this pipeline step. And this is to do the work, right? So here I'm executing basically an HTTP call to fetch that JSON, comes back, we process it, it goes through a batch thing, and then we add that data back in as a plugin for the next processor to be able to handle that data and process that data as we need to do. And all this code is going to be on GitHub, so you can kind of poke through it, you know, when you, to your heart's delight, and look at some of the stuff more closely. But basically, at the end, we have these, where did it go? We have these pipeline batches. So, you know, I have these blank folders here. We can run this. There's a run pipeline batch to manually run this batch. Basically, this is going to call these two pipelines the read WordPress authors and read WordPress categories. So it's going to start loading in all the authors and categories into my folders here. This is the log. It should be kicking up in a second. You can check the status. It takes a second to warm up sometimes. Waiting. While we're waiting for this, meanwhile, we'll talk about kind of the tenant service, which I also have installed. So the tenant service, you know, it's a completely separate application. There's a separate URL. You can configure the tenant service in here from an endpoint perspective. Basically, from these settings, I'm saying any, you know, for my tenant service, any request that comes in with a /blog on it, I want it to run read WordPress blog posts, right? So this is still all configured in here, even though it's running on a separate process on a separate server. Let's see how our process is going here. Oh, it's done. So you can see all our authors in here. Let's find a really cool one in particular. Right, so there's me. That's the URL for my author URL, and then in here I actually have my WordPress ID. And so Data Exchange Framework will do an upsert, which means that if it looks for this ID, and if it finds an item with this ID already, it'll just update it instead of creating a whole new one. So you still get fidelity with your item IDs as you're making updates. And then so we have our authors, we have our categories, right? And now let's put it all together. We don't have blog posts yet. So we're going to call the tenant service to do that execution. So I have that custom code that we just looked at deployed to our tenant service instance. It's going to be running that code, and then it's going to be using the item service on the Sitecore content management server to be able to kind of read that data and then pull it in and then write the JSON fetch data back into Sitecore. So it's all going through that Sitecore item web service. Takes a second. I have it maxed out, I think 300 blog posts, so it won't take forever. So you get a little I'm done notification. And here are our blog posts. Very cool. So you can see if we just pick one here, right? This is the title, the author. It actually links up to one of the authors in the author section, the date, the excerpt, categories, the URL for the actual blog post. And again, we kind of see that WordPress ID. So we're not pulling all that data, right? I'm not pulling the actual blog post itself, but just an excerpt. So I can use this information to surface up like a card or something to a user that's personalized, saying, hey, this guy is interested in EM rock stars. So let's serve up this card for this blog post. I can have all this data in there ready. And all it does is have a link to send you to the actual blog post itself. All right, so that's kind of wraps up some of the quick demo-y stuff. Move back. So for all that code that we kind of looked at, and including all the items, it's all unicorn synchronized in there. You can go in, it's on my GitHub under DEF providers. The DEF tenant service and tenant service documentation from Sitecore itself is that link right there. It looks sparse, but once you start clicking and expanding all the various sections, it starts to get very big very quickly. So there's a lot there. And last thing is just tell all your friends how great data exchange framework is. Play with it yourself, get to know it a little bit better. Hopefully it becomes a tool in your tool belt that you use from a data migration perspective. And I hope that this session and this presentation kind of gave you a little bit more insight and a little bit more motivation in kind of understanding what it is and what you can do with it. So that's it. Thank you. Appreciate you guys joining me this evening, morning, afternoon. For no less than the 23rd time, please donate. I know that we're kind of inching up on the amount donated, but this is such a huge deal. This is why we've definitely brought this up no less than 23 times. So anything that you can give, again, it's such a great cause and a timely cause and a cause that's affecting all of us currently. So, and with that, there's a break room. You should already be in there talking about how great I am. And if you have any questions, now's the time. You can find me on Slack or Twitter, Stack Exchange. More than happy to field any questions afterwards if you can't sleep in the middle of the night and you're thinking about data exchange framework and you have a pressing question, ping me. And if I'm not asleep, I might answer you.
Great. Thanks, George. That's really good. Good to get a dive into that. And I'm sure a lot of us have heard of DEF before, but haven't dared jump in, right?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of questions that have come in so far.
Okay.
Does DEF run the data migration using a transaction-based pattern, which might prevent incomplete data modifications, something similar to SQL Server transactions?
Yeah, so that's going to depend on how you write it, right? Like DEF doesn't do too much from like on its own, right? If you're writing something transactional for SQL, for instance, right? I think the SQL provider that Sitecore provides is transactional, but it's going if it's a custom system that you're writing to, that's going to be on how you implement it. And so If you implement it to handle kind of more of a transactional way, then it will be.
Great. Can DEF sync failure prevent cycle content authors changing the data in the content in the cycle content item?
Yeah.
Example, the source of truth is the external system. However, cycle users can change that external data in cycle.
Yep.
Nonetheless, the data should not change.
Right. And this is where kind of security comes into play. I would say any data that you're importing in, while it can be changed by content authors, they really shouldn't be. And you can use security to, section off a portion of your content tree for that, or whatever the case might be. Even if a content author does manage to get in there and change something, the next synchronization would just put it back to whatever values from the source of truth. It's going to override it anyways. So any kind of badness would only be temporary.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't see anything else. Nothing else?
Cool.
Everybody got it. There you go. Everybody
Sweet.
be using DEF tomorrow.
Yes, I expect nothing less. Cool.
Still got a bit of time, I think.
Yep. All right. We have up to 5,353 euros. That's awesome. It's going up, but we need it to go up even higher. We're halfway through the goal and we have one session left. So we have to do something. So if each person donates just a little bit, whatever they can afford, that would really help us bring this number up. So the last few donations are Raju Balagam, Santiago Morla, donated recently as well. So please donate. Help the people who are in the healthcare profession. This fund is run by WHO, and every dollar counts. So what was that, Ken?
Bruce looks like Chris Isaac.
Handsome, right?
Of course,
Maybe.
mate.
Just a little bit.
Wickedly handsome, mate.
No, I was thinking the same about you, really.
Putting us all to shame.
Turning into a love fest here. Even Akshay's looking dignified this morning.
Got it down.
That's right. What do you mean? What about last night? I was wearing a nice the user group Switzerland shirt. I'd look dignified then too. I didn't have a collar, but still.
I was hoping that story would be more scandalous.
What
about last night usually leads into?
We can edit it in post.
Perfect.
Can you share your webcam, Jackie?
We just need to make him say something else.
No, I'm gonna do it with nothing. Yes, I can. There we go.
That could be scandalous too, Jackie.
It could be.
Really scandalous.
No, see, I got dressed and I wore like.
Oh, look, you're all professional.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
I'm very
Nice.
professionally dressed.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for making the time. I know it's
Oh. Thank you for having me.
No worries. All right, we have about 12 minutes. So in the meantime, you could head on out to the break room. I know there's still a few people in there to chat. There's the SUGCON channel on Slack, which seems to be quite busy. And yet again, the donate slide, like George said, it's been shown more than 23 times. Oh, look, it went up again. So let's see who helped us.
Yay.
So we got, oh, Suresh donated. So thanks, Suresh. Yes, indeed. How's everything, Jackie, in your neck of the woods?
Pretty good. It feels weird to say that because nothing is good. Nothing is really fine, but I'm fine, relatively.
Is it all locked down where you are as well, or?
Sort of. I live in Portland, but I'm not in Portland right now. because I realized this was going to go on for a while and I live alone. And
Okay, yeah.
that's what happened to Mrs. Havisham. She just started rattling around in her house and wearing like an old wedding dress, and everybody forgot that she was there while she decorated with cobwebs. So I was actually just checking because I came to hang out with my parents and I'm in their office. So I was just checking to make sure that none of like my baby pictures are visible because they definitely have them hanging on the wall. Fortunately, I don't think you can see any of that. So
Just move the camera around a little.
yeah, can you just like pan around the room? I went to high school in the like early aughts. That's all you need to know about my senior photos. They look exactly like you're imagining they look. The end. And everybody here is doing well. I like that Bruce has like his God filter happening.
He's got his Chris Isaac filter.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, it's very nice.
Yeah.
Yes, do that. Maybe he's born with it. Maybe it's heavenly intervention.
Bruce Almighty.
So we got a couple more people. So Jesper Ball, David Dawson, Javier Barrera donated. Thank you. So it's now 5,640 euros. That's awesome.
Nice.
Keep talking, Jackie. Maybe it's you.
Well, maybe it is.
They're probably
I am
tired
charming.
of looking at our faces. They
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
some different face, prettier face than us.
Different face. I don't know if that does it, but if it does, it's a great
It actually
cause.
did. One more person. Neil Pun. Keep doing that, Jackie. Maybe we'll get a couple more
Maybe we
dollars.
should
This
all
feels
maybe
wrong.
we should all shut our cameras off, right?
Probably. Just leave Jackie on there.
Yeah, this is where we've been
I
going.
do have a call out for it in my deck.
Yeah.
So see
If
what
you can
happens.
sing and dance.
We just
Zach.
need Jackie and Mike Shaw, and we'd rake in the dollars.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, looks like Zach needs attention. Didn't you already donate, Zach?
He did. He said he was going to
so
donate
that
again.
we call your name out?
He just wants a shout out for DXG again.
DXG. No one's gonna use it. Jeez.
Fighting words.
They might if he donates again, right?
Sure. I'll use it if you donate a good amount in the next 5 minutes. And I'll do a blog post, Zach, on what I find about DXG. But it might be good or bad. I can't promise. But if you donate more than 3 figures, then I'll do a blog post on DXG on the Cannabis website.
I was actually trying to think of something that I could offer as like a bribe to get people to donate, but unfortunately I can't find what I was going to offer. So I'll have to find it and offer it next time.
We have
Is it a
another
hedgehog?
Jesper who
Is
donated.
it a hedgehog? No. No,
Oh my
it's more brutally embarrassing than that, which is why I thought that it might earn quite a bit of money.
Now that is intriguing. All
Good,
right, so if we hit the 10,000, Jackie's gonna go find this.
I mean, I wish I could promise that. Unfortunately, I've moved like 3 times since then, so it could be in any of those boxes.
Gosh, now we're getting.
But nothing else to do.
It's you,
I'll
Jackie.
tell you what,
Do right now.
if we reach 10,000, I will tell you what it is. And if we reach 20,000, I will find it and share it with all those who donated.
Oh boy. So now we're up to 5,728. It's got to be Jackie. It's you. You seem to.
Because I just offered a mysterious bribe. Everybody's like, I want to know what it is. Like, I'm not even going to tell you unless we hit 10,000.
Joe Bissell is guessing it's a lightsaber.
It's not, although that is a good guess.
Anything
It's gotta
Harry
be
Potter-y
something
related?
more than a hedgehog.
It is definitely more than a hedgehog. It is not anything Harry Potter related.
What about Star Wars? Mythical characters?
Nope.
No? Oh, jeez. Now you lost all my interest.
No, I promise you're interested.
Okay. Come on, guys. Can we get to 10,000 from 5,700? Zach owns a
Everybody.
huge mansion. He could donate some of it.
Just sell your house,
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going
jeez.
to need it.
obviously. It's
Take care
very
of the
safe to be outside right now. You obviously don't need a house.
He's not going to donate his house. It's made of Legos, apparently.
Oh,
You can donate the Legos.
Could be a collectible.
All right, couple more minutes. Let's see if it's gone up again.
we're in the final countdown.
This is it. This is the final session.
Yep.
Yay.
Front one.
Ultimate session. Yeah, it's flown by.
Flew by almost like in 24 hours.
Yeah.
Feels like we just started yesterday.
around this time. All right, Jackie, I'm going to give you the presenter if you want to switch to the
Thank you.
donate slide once you get it. That would be awesome.
Oh, yep. Sure thing. Wait, I want to pick which screen.
Beautiful.
Oh man, that's gorgeous. Where's that?
What did I?
It's behind Zach's house.
That's why
There's
it's
a
down.
drop down under the show screen in the conference controls if you missed it in the dialogue.
Oh, there it is. What the heck? Sorry, everybody.
No worries. Let me take it back and give it back
Okay.
to you.
Everyone
probably
taught
be
me how to
easier.
do this. I work in
Yep.
tech. It's totally fine. I know exactly what I'm doing. I want to show this screen. I want to pick which screen I show. Screen. There we go. Screen and monitor 2. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, can everybody see it? Okay,
Yes,
cool.
we can.
So I'm switching to, or attempting to switch to the donate slide. One moment. Okay. Donate. Everybody see the donate slide?
Yes.
We're in a good place. Awesome.
Oh, wow. We got a couple more.
That's great.
Zach
Hooray.
donated a tiny amount. It's 3 figures, but there's a digit in between. These all numbers, man. Suhash, Shivaram, Powell, Adam, Urban. Nice. Thank you. So we are up to 5,774.
Nice.
That is cool.